The Forum at 8 with Xolani Gwala.
It is now 7 minutes after 8. Well, inundated with responses to the announcement a little earlier on that South Africa will be committing about $2 billion to the IMF fund. I will be reading some of these a little later on, but of course you can send more at gwalax@sabc.co.za, gwalax@sabc.co.za. But broadly also talking about how do you think world leaders should be dealing with the global economic crisis at the moment? What is it that you are expecting from world leaders, and what is it that a country such as South Africa and other developing countries should learn from the crisis, whose epicenter is clearly in Europe at the moment? Would like to hear from you. gwalax@sabc.co.za. Also send me a text message this morning at 34701, 34701. A little later on we'll take your calls on 0891 104 208. Take the number down, 0891 104 208. Let me quickly introduce my guests on the program this morning. I'll start with Dr. Iraj Abedian. He's a founder and chief executive of Pan African Capital Holdings. A very good morning to you, Dr. Abedian. Nice having you on the radio again this morning.
Thank you very much, Xolani, and greetings to the listeners.
Thanks indeed. Also on the line for us, Dr. Penelope Hawkins, managing director at Feasibility, which is an economic policy and research company. Dr. Hawkins, good morning to you.
Morning to you all.
Thank you very much. We are joined on the line from Athens now by James Hertling. He is European politics editor at Bloomberg News. James, good morning.
Good morning to you.
Thank you very much, James, for joining us. Well, maybe we should start in Athens this morning. What is the atmosphere like following, of course, the elections in Greece a couple of days ago, and what is transpiring as a result? Also, people, I suppose, are monitoring the G20 meeting in Mexico. What is the atmosphere like?
You know, there's a real feeling of business as usual since a bullet was dodged, if you will, at the election. So people are just going about their business, and even the politicians are going about their business. They're expressing great urgency at the need to form a government, but right now we're going into day two, and the leaders of the parties who are going to need to urgently form a coalition are going about their business, holding meetings, doing their horse trading, and except for the vast numbers of journalists here, there really is a feeling of business as usual.
It's quite interesting, James, you say since the bullet was dodged, and a couple of people have been saying to us that all it is really just kicking the can further down the road. This will catch up with Greece in a matter of months.
Well, that's another very powerful image, and one that unless it continues to get more help from the rest of Europe, that very well may be the case that can is going to go over the cliff, if you'll forgive the metaphor.
And talking about the can over the cliff, what is it that Europe should do for Greece, do you think?
Well, what I think is, I'm not allowed to have opinions because I'm a journalist, but what seems to the core of the problem is in Europe is you have a bunch of separate nations carrying on their own policies. However, it's halfway towards a real union, and the countries that have conducted themselves responsibly from the point of view of their national budgets, they don't want to be in the position of having to provide more support to the countries that haven't, and yet that is really the step that has to happen, and they have to come to terms with that. Otherwise, the experts we speak to, the economists, the political scientists, say that this European construction that began after World War II and has been one of the great experiments of human history will come to an end.
And that is why there's been a lot of pressure then on German Chancellor Angela Merkel to intervene more decisively in this regard.
That's exactly right. And in fact, she has opposition even at home. The opposition party is pushing for her to do more. However, there's her political party and her political base is very much opposed indeed to providing more aid to countries around the periphery of Europe.
That's interesting. Let me come back to Dr. Abedian. Then we've heard an announcement here this morning in South Africa that South Africa has committed $2 billion in this regard. What are your thoughts initially?
I think it's part of South Africa being an international citizen and being a member of IMF. It has to play its role. So that's the context in which South Africa has to play its role. Incidentally, Xolani, if you think 2 billion has raised so much emotions, imagine if you were running this show in Germany, that every week 10 10 billion, 20 billion, 100 billion has to be sort of pledged for Spain, for Italy, for Greece. Imagine the surge of emotions there. So I think it is a political issue. It's also a risk mitigation issue. Clearly, the rate at which the European problem is spreading globally, bringing the global growth down from above 5% to below 4%, possibly around 3.6, 3.7 at the moment. That means a lot of countries are going to run into balance of payments problem. And therefore, not only the European countries, but some African countries, some Asian countries will run into this problem. And IMF is designed to sort out those type of problems. And therefore, they have to get their acts together, resource it in anticipation, and South Africa is playing a part in that regard.
But Dr. Abedian, I think people would want to hear perhaps whether Greece is not just a bottomless pit, that we're throwing this money and this is not going to end. What is the end game, though?
The end game is, unfortunately, the Europeans have to agree on. It's a political end game. They got to accept that you cannot have single currency without some fiscal union, however loosely or tightly designed, a federal system of some sort, whether it's like the U.S. Type of federal fiscal system or another variations, until and unless the Europeans cross that bridge openly and in a way transparently and technically correctly, they're going to go from one crisis to another. And it absolutely boggles the mind as to how they think they can just find a solution by delaying and procrastination.
I'm going to come back to Dr. Hawkins in a minute, but James, let me go back to you then. Your response to what Dr. Abedian is saying here, because you probably will be talking to a lot of analysts about the political moves and the steps that need to be taken in this regard.
Well, that's right. He phrased the problem and the solution very well indeed. Everything is a half measure until there's a sense of that there's a political endgame, and that's what the markets are waiting for. The officials here, the president of the central bank, Mario Draghi, has referred to a report that was written in 1988, 1989, that laid out the steps that would emerge 13 years later in the euro, and that's the kind of thing that might be necessary. That there's not going to be a solution today or tomorrow or next week or next year, but if there's a sense that at the end of the road there's a real federal fiscal union, that's the kind of step that markets are waiting for.
But take us as ordinary people through that. Why would the fiscal union make a difference?
That's a great question, and it's somewhat easier for me to answer because you may or may not be able to tell I'm an American, and I'm an American from New York State.
Yeah.
So New York State pays much more in taxes than it collects in revenue. The wealth that New York State generates helps support fellow citizens in other states, in Mississippi, in Alabama, in Montana, for example, which are some states in the U.S. And nobody complains. It's the part of being in the federal union, and we all benefit from each other. In Europe, for example, Germany has benefited tremendously from their ability to export to fast-growing economies or economies that were fast-growing. In Spain, for example, and in Greece during the most of the first decade of the 21st century, and they benefit from a union. And what they have to do is recognize that there's a shared fate, and that's the political piece. And the budgetary piece is some economies are just much more competitive than others.
All right, let me come back to Dr. Hawkins then. Yesterday, our Finance Minister, Pravin Gordhan, Dr. Hawkins, was quoted as saying not only is he watching what's going on in Europe with trepidation, but also he says with repeated bouts of hope and despair. I understand despair, but I'm not sure about hope. Are you hopeful?
Well, I think, basically what happens is that when you have a crisis like this, at some stage people realize they have to take charge. And I think what has been happening for quite a few months, even years, has been there's almost been a sense of denial. I remember when I was studying in Scotland not so long ago, I remember that there was a huge draw on EU funds in countries like Scotland and Ireland and, of course, Greece where EU funds in the boom times were used to build the infrastructure in those countries. So you'd find these magnificent roads in rural Scotland, which nobody quite understood why they were there, but there would be a big sign saying this was funded by EU funds.
Oh.
And I think the problem is that part of what's been going on with the EU is a bit like perhaps the banking crisis in the US at the beginning. There was this kind of sense of denial. It can't really be happening to us, and things are going to improve. And also, of course, it builds into that narrative that certainly deluded the people in the US in the subprime markets that there's only one way up, or one way, and that's up in the economy. And I think with the EU process, people have been kind of really like ostriches. Let's not look at the reality because it will get better. I think now what is happening in the G20 meetings is that the world leaders are saying to the Eurozone, actually, guys, we are really worried about this, and better you take it seriously and do something about it. And, I mean, just like James and Derocha said, we need a very detailed program. It's not enough to say there is money in the kitty. I mean, remember what we're dealing with here is dealing with uncertainty of the markets. And the way in which you deal with that is that you say we've got some strengths, and that's important. You've got to have money in the kitty. That's important. But it's also very important to be able to calm the markets by saying this is the program. We're going to do this in the short term. We're going to do this in the medium term. And this is our long-term vision. And unless you actually spell it out, people are unnerved by the fact that, first of all, we hear that Greece has got a deficit 3 times that it should be in terms of the Maastricht Treaty, and then it's 4 times, and then maybe it could be even higher than that. And so people are saying, well, we'll throw some money at it. But unless we understand how Greece is going to repay, how we're going to deal directly with Spain, what's going to happen in the Italian solution, we get locked up into this uncertainty. And, of course, with uncertainty you have both hopes and fears.
Yeah.
But the issue is that unless you can retain a period, hopefulness for a certain period of time, you're not going to emerge out of it.
All right, Dr. Abedian, I'm going to ask you just to connect the dots again for us here as South Africans. Why, for instance, is our finance minister talking about trepidation and these kind of things? But before you do that, again, let me go back to James, because, we're so far away, James. Perhaps we don't have an idea of the streets in Athens. What has changed? How has this affected the people's day-to-day lives?
Well, the unemployment rate is much higher. It's almost 25%. And that's the most significant change, and more than that, I think there's a probably more of a sense of not desperation. That's a little too strong, but almost despair at what the future holds. There's a brain drain. People are leaving. People are leaving to go to the U.S. People are leaving to go to Northern Europe. But in terms of the day-to-day lives, just the number of shops that are closed and the number of people out of work are probably the biggest change indeed, and you just see that in any street where you walk past a number of boarded shops.
And there are suspicions. People are already saying that perhaps what you're going to see, instability. You're going to see a lot of protests in the streets. Have you seen some already?
I have seen them here, but not during this. Not in the past few days. In fact, some of the political scientists and others that we speak to have expressed surprise that not just in Greece but in Spain and Italy that you haven't seen more the politics of the streets coming to bear.
Dr. Abedian, is that why we should worry that perhaps the effects may very well be politics of the streets for us?
Absolutely. I think we've got to worry because the European Union is the single largest bloc in the global economy. It has huge impact in terms of trade and so on countries like China. If China cannot sell to the European Union, they won't buy our commodities, iron ore, coal, etc., etc. So the interdependence of nations, as we have it from an economic point of view under the force of globalization, has meant that when a major bloc like Europe goes under and goes into severe structural instability, which they experience now, it is not a short-term cyclical 6 months, 9 months. Even if the Europeans agree to the real solution, it will take them in something between 7 to 10 years, possibly 15 years to stabilize themselves, to back to growth and back to a robust block in the global economy. Now, in that time, we have to ask what's going to happen to us in South Africa, but more broadly to sub-Saharan Africa. Let me just give you a number that may bring some element of reality into this. The global economy coming from 5% growth to 3.7, that means 200 million people in sub-Saharan Africa are now going to regress in terms of their projected income growth, coming out of poverty, going back to the age of dependency where they were 10 years ago. Now, this is just in our region alone. The implications of that for politics, for stability, for social progress, and for economic growth are quite serious for us. And that's part of the despair that I think the Minister of Finance is talking about.
But what should we do then? What lessons should we learn from this ongoing situation?
I mean, there are many, many lessons. One is that whenever there is some experimentation such as Euro, you can't do it half-baked. And now at home, there are lessons to be learned. If we dealing, for example, for us, a major item at the moment in terms of our infrastructure backlog is that we cannot do half-baked stuff. We cannot go half-measure. We got to think it through. We got to apportion it, and the government should not finance what it should not finance. Otherwise, down the line, we're going to have fiscal liabilities that are not sustainable, and of course, then fiscal conditions become unsustainable. The poor suffer the most, and it leads to political instability.
All right,
that's just one lesson.
Sure. Let me take a commercial break. I'll take more lessons in a little while, but also I'll open the lines here on 0891 104 208, 0891 104 208. I'll also be taking emails. gwalax@sabc.co.za, gwalax@sabc.co.za.
The Forum at 8 with Xolani Gwala.
I'm going to go to Dr. Hawkins in a minute for more lessons on what's going on in Europe at the moment. But let me quickly hear from Len in Cape Town on the line. Good morning, Len. Len, are you there? Do we have this call? All right, we seem to have a slight problem with this call. Dr. Hawkins, then, lessons?
One of the big things that comes out of the Eurozone is how, in fact, we do need whatever economic tools we've got to hand to improve our economies. And one of the big problems with being part of a monetary union is that you lose control of certain of those instruments as an economy that's perhaps in a deteriorating growth stage. And I think one of the things that comes out as well is that you actually cannot live on credit forever. And South Africans tend to be increasingly living on credit, and part of that is because we appear to be reliant on so few earners, and we do really have a jobs crisis. And I think one of the things that comes out of the European message for us is that we have to remember how dependent we are as a small open economy on the rest of the world.
All right. There seems to be just a slight problem, Dr. Hawkins, on the line. We'll sort it out in a minute. But let me read this email and get responses from my guests at the moment. Somebody says, the Greek crisis is a Euro crisis, in turn, a crisis of the financial and economic system of the West, at the heart of which is imbalances, be it income disparities, excess funny money versus real wealth, or excess debt-fueled demand. The latter brought about the financial meltdown of 2008. What we are seeing now is the deep fissures exposed by 2000s and papered over by the vested financial interests. You cannot have every consumer and capital good produced in one country in the world and not expect to reach a crisis point. The current trade balance between China and the rest of the world is yet another unsustainable imbalance. Asking the Chinese to emulate the West and start spending is disingenuous and symptomatic of how bereft our ideas, or of ideas the so-called experts are. That's Ketla on email. Do you have a response there, Dr. Abedian?
There's a lot of truth in what you just read, in the sense that if you look at a country like Spain and to some extent Greece, there's an over-financialization of these economies, in the sense that the banks have lent to projects, be it construction projects or other projects that they were essentially unsustainable, or lent to individuals who could not sustain that level of debt over time. To believe that the economy will always grow at 6 and 7% is just naive. So, of course, the banks have ended up with this liability, and of course now they're pushing the entire society to pay for their mistakes, and that's part of this complex situation that Europeans have have grappled with. They're always focusing on the banks and the financial institution as opposed to focusing on the real side of the economy, where growth is, where job creation is, and where the average citizen's welfare is affected. I think there's a lot of truth in what you just said.
Let me quickly take Len in Cape Town. Hello, Len.
Hi, good morning.
Hi.
As a citizen of the country, it's very noble of our government to be giving away $2 billion. Now, my contention is that we have crisis in South Africa, massive unemployment. We've got this toll road saga, which is a creation of government. Why don't they rather settle problems at home and let other people worry about their problems?
All right.
Either that or the alternative. Take what equates to probably 17 billion rand and give every single person in South Africa 32,000 rand and say, right, get out of the trouble. That would be the correct thing to do. Think about people at home before you worry about others.
All right. Let me ask Dr. Abedian to respond to that, and it's probably going to be his last answer because he needs to go elsewhere. He has another prior arrangement. Dr. Abedian, then in wrapping up?
Yeah, I think if we go that route and there is temptation, it's exactly the argument that the Germans, at least part of the German population, is raising. Why do you want to give 300 billion to southern states, Spain, Portugal, and so on? Spread that 300 billion amongst Germans and we'll all be happy and we won't have any problems. The issue is that if we do not anticipate problems ahead of global problems that are going to come to haunt us, we can give everybody 32,000 rand only to realize the sub-Saharan African region goes into a complete contraction, the global economy falls apart, and then that 32,000 rand is going nowhere. So you've got to deal with this issue in a coordinated global manner with absolute political cohesion. Unfortunately, that's what's lacking at the moment. But South Africa's gesture in this regard is the right gesture. Whether it will be used for the right thing, that I have my doubts because I'm not sure if the Europeans will come to the party as a political leadership. That's a concern that I have. But the gesture, there is nothing wrong with it, and we have to play our role as a global citizen.
All right, Dr. Abedian, I thank you very much. Thanks indeed for joining us this morning. What I'll do is I'll take the news update now, but when I come back, I'm going to ask James as well to weigh in on this discussion. What are people saying on the ground about some of these initiatives that are taken by, among others, IMF? What also are people saying about this debate on austerity versus spending? Because that debate has been going on for a while, where other people are saying, well, you're coming up with these very strict austerity measures, but to what extent then are they strangling growth and therefore not helping in this regard? What are people saying on the ground? But also, Dr. Hawkins will weigh in on that discussion. If you have anything to say or anything to ask, 0891 104 208.
The Forum at 8 with Xolani Gwala.
23 before 9, I'll take your calls on 0891 104 208, 0891 104 208. A lot of emails have come through at gwalax@sabc.co.za. I'll look at them in a minute. But remember, my guests on the line, James Hertling, his European politics editor at Bloomberg News, is in Athens for us this morning. But also I'm joined on the line by Dr. Penelope Hawkins, Managing Director at Feasibility and Economic Policy Research Company. Let me go back to you then, James. Before the news headlines, I was asking this question, firstly, about these initiatives that are taken, including the ones where South Africa has contributed. These firewall initiatives, what are experts saying about them?
For the most part, experts are saying they're not big enough, they're not strong enough to protect and to support the most vulnerable economies in Europe if they're unable to borrow on the financial markets. And I speak, of course, of Spain and Italy. We're talking about economies that between them have a GDP of maybe $4 trillion. So you can imagine that would be a problem if they if they could not borrow on financial markets.
Certainly. Yesterday, I heard an interview with an ordinary Greece resident who was saying, look, the problem is we want to stay within the euro, but give us at least about 2 years and then start demanding repayment. I suppose the point about it was that people were saying, we want to grow this economy first. Give us an opportunity to grow this economy. But I'm just wondering, what is this argument then about austerity and its strangling effect on the economic growth and these measures that are being forced upon the Greek people, particularly by the Germans?
Well, there's an underlying assumption there, and one of the biggest problems for Europe right now in making policy is the significant credibility gap that Greece has. In order to get into the euro a decade ago, they basically made up their figures, and now it's generally acknowledged they should not have been permitted in. And throughout the last, you recall in 2009, the reason this all was started was because it turns out they had been lying about and fudging their numbers for a decade. And since they got their first rescue package in 2010, they've basically not been able to hit any of the targets that were set as a condition of the money. So now that's where we are now. So when people talk about, or when Greece says we'd like an extra year or 2 years or 3 years to get up off the ground, the problem that the creditors have, and it's not just Germany, but it's many other countries, is they're concerned that unless they keep the pressure on, nothing will actually get done.
Here's an email for you, Dr. Hawkins. Somebody says, in fact, it's Reg who was sent this email this morning. He says, your so-called experts are not answering the key problem. The real problem is the type of capitalism we have today, plus the policy misadventures they indulge and continue to indulge that accumulated debt. Unless we change this type of capitalism and stop the policy misadventures, we can have hope of a respite. We need change. We need to change the model of economic system, governance, its institutions, and mostly the banking system that transfers money from poor to rich. All what your experts are telling us are symptoms. We need a real debate on the issues here if there are to be any changes in the global economic system. Regards, Reg. What do you think about that?
Well, I think what Reg is saying, and I think there is a real sense in which that is right, is that when you have a crisis, and we've been in crisis now as a global economy since about 2007, there is often an opportunity to say, what are we doing wrong? And is it not possible for us to change the way we're doing certain things? Now, the big difficulty, in a way, with the ideological debate that Roger is bringing in here is that clearly there are, even if one were to theoretically create a construct where we could say, okay, this would be a better system than what we have now, the big problem is how do we get there? And I think one of the big problems we have in a country like South Africa is that we have for very many decades been aware that we're dependent on the global economy for additional demand. We also sometimes delude ourselves that we're going to get a lot of foreign direct investment from others. And there's almost a sense in which we have, to some extent, our policy debate has been not as strong as it could be because we're looking elsewhere for solutions. And I think in the South African context, at least, I'm not going to necessarily address the entire, global economy that Roger is now dealing with. But from a South African economy, what is it that we can do in this opportunity? And the thing that seems to me is that we have to face facts that in South Africa, unless we can create policy that is also credible, that makes sense and that is actually implemented in terms of really addressing problems with job creation, with skills, over both the long and short term, we are going to continue to be very subject to the vagaries of the rest of the world. You look at, say, the Europe and how important it is to our economy. As a consequence of that, we've seen that while the European currency, the euro, has been depreciating, we've been depreciating along with that, in tandem. But in fact, we've been weakening relative to that. So it gives you a sense that we can't say, look, we're a strong economy, and so therefore we're a solution. So we need to focus on what our short, medium, and long-term solutions are.
All right, let me take some calls. Edwin and George, good morning.
Look, this country must wake up. We still have a chance to fight. We've got a system of mirrors here. People talk about extending credit to get out of debt. That's impossible. It makes it worse. We have a terrible explosion. It's all organized that way. The people we see in government are corrupt individuals put there to further the ends of the financial boys and the pharmaceutical bodies and so forth. You can ask your American friend there if his son has a lump on his body and he goes to take something natural to put it right which will cure him, his doctor will be in great trouble. You find we've got overcrowding and attendant poverty with industrialization for the sake of wealth in inverted commas, which ungoverned, it devalues the hard-earned currency of the populace, dilutes the land, and we've got countries in Europe which have decreasing populations talking about growth. Growth for whose benefit? It's not for, as with here, it's not for the benefit of the Chinese and the sweatshops or the South African unemployed when we've got plenty of work to do here if we can keep our dignity and be independent. Yeah. This business of materialism, the corruption in education where our morals and ethics are destroyed because you can't have people who are ethically strong and morally strong, you can't control them, you see. We need to look after ourselves, be secure, independent, and dignified, get rid of corruption which runs America now. Their constitution is being steamrolled. Offer people something for nothing. Once they vote for you, you've got them, and then your constitution is steamrolled. You've got King Barack there. Here we have a wonderful dancer, Zuma here, but this can't see the wood for the trees. There's plenty of work to do here. South Africa doesn't want its people to be slaves. Offer the people something for nothing, the simple people, and they pull themselves into the pit, Kalani.
All right, that's Edwin and George. Thank you. Alec is in Johannesburg. Hello, Alec. Alec?
Hello.
Yes, hi.
Good morning.
Yeah, hi, go ahead.
Sorry, Kalani, I had to get that in. Simply stated, current economic theory and the instruments and mechanisms that inform its practice are predisposed towards feudalism. The financial system, when deconstructed, is patently evident that it simply replaced the feudal mechanisms that existed when they did, and after there were revolts and uprisings to overturn that system of injustice. Now, all that's happened is that the current economic theory and paradigms have run their course in history through that epoch. And so it has become obsolete and redundant based on where the world as a society has evolved to in terms of equitable wealth, which is impossible under the capitalist paradigm. It is mathematically and logically impossible for there to be equity within a capitalist system. And we can talk about that at another point in time. Now, one of your emails has alluded to this already, and I'd like to hear your guests comment more on that, because these guests and the experts that we hear day in and day out, year in and year out, admit, because if they knew what they were talking about, we would not have this crisis. All that's happening in the world at the moment, based on expert advice, is preservation of that system, preservation of the order of hierarchy and advantaged. So the objective function, which is the countervailing argument in all these discussions, is equitable wealth and the consequent on social behavior and conduct.
All right, Alec, let me just pick out something.
Solved. Kalani, just one moment, because this is very important. But the experts have studied the system. They have not thought outside the box, and therein lies the problem, is that the experts themselves perpetuate the system by virtue of their learning that they are only capable of thinking within the context of the prevailing theory, and therein lies the problem.
All right, but you know what I wanted to do? I wanted to ask you just something. You say the current economic system effectively has run its course. But again, I suppose people will say, fine, it is happening in Europe, but why then do we have certain parts of the world economy where there is growth?
Because those are underdeveloped, and you can go to Bertrand Russell's History of Philosophy and you will see it, because it's not about metaphysical blah-de-blah. It's about the world and the way in which it functions. And it says that a wealthy society can only exist where there is a pool of slave labor. So where there is growth taking place, it is coming off a low base of destitution. And where the system itself is being perpetuated.
Sure, but look at a country such as Germany.
Look
at a country such as Germany. Does it exhibit the kind of characters that you're talking about? Is there slavery?
Beg your pardon?
A country such as Germany, it is growing.
Well, you got to understand, Kalani, you got to understand slavery within the context of the modern machinations, which is debt. Okay, because what in effect is debt is you working for the benefit of somebody else. Okay, based on their power position, which is nothing more than the landlord serfdom situation. So ultimately, even Germany within that context, okay, is to a large extent determinant for their standard of living based on the produce of lesser societies or less powerful societies that are unable to obtain a price equivalent to the productive value of labor. Okay, so the system is actually fairly complex and fairly opaque to seeing it for what it is, but you have to analyze it and deconstruct it. And you will then understand that through the pricing mechanism and through power relations, which is fundamentally how profit is generated, okay, because you can only generate a profit through a power relation, through a leverage position, meaning you're in a stronger bargaining position, which means that in effect you pay somebody less for their labor value than you would be paid for it.
All right.
By virtue of their weaker bargaining position. Now, if that's not slavery, then nothing else is.
All right.
Then there isn't such a thing.
All right. I'll ask my guest. And by the way, I'm not defending the system. I just wanted to clarify certain points that you're making here. All right. I'll take more calls. 0891 104 208. 0891 104 208. My guest will respond in a second.
The Forum at 8 with Xolani Gwala.
9 minutes now before 9. Let me go to, is it Mabule in Pulukwane? Good morning.
Hi, Xolani.
Hi, welcome.
Yeah, I wanted to say, in my view, I think lessons to be learned from this is that, the European Union will have to develop an exit policy for countries that want to pull out. Because, in maybe the next country, Spain or Portugal or any other country might have another radical party winning the elections and threatening to pull out again and will be on the same situation. And I don't think that's something that the European Union thought about it when they developed this. They assumed everybody will always be in and that everybody will exercise the fiscal discipline, which we have seen is not happening because obviously they don't have the control over the government budgets. So I think going forward, they'll need to make sure that they have an exit strategy and maybe try and increase the powers that the European Union would have over fiscal management of various countries.
All right, let me read some emails then coming in at 8 minutes before 9 before I take more calls. Stu Motlameni, the president of COSATU, has sent in an email that says public servants cannot accept that government will give this money to the IMF, and I think this is going to be quite interesting. He says the public servants cannot accept that government will give this money to the IMF to bail out the developed world when at home only 6.5% is offered to them. That's COSATU president Stu Motlameni on email. Dr. Hawkins, quickly just respond to this because there are a lot of SMSs and emails about this 2 billion commitment that the South African government has made.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think we just need to make quite clear that this is not money that's coming out of the budget. So in other words, we're not pulling money out of the budget that would have been given to salary increases or expansion in capital expenditure and improvement of roads. This is money that has been, if you like, it's our international savings. So it's as if we've got foreign exchange reserves and we have committed that if there is such a need, we will be prepared to extend. It's like a guarantee. It's like a surety that we've given. It's not a payment that's gone into anybody else's account at this stage. It's a commitment that we will contribute this money, but then it will have to be repaid in terms of international rules. So it's like we're prepared to give this money on the grounds that it will be loaned from us and repaid. Remember what we're doing here is remember I spoke earlier and I said when you've got uncertainty, you've got various things that you've got to deal with. And one of the things that you've got to try and do, remember how I'd like to just talk about some of the comments that come from Alex and Raj again at some stage. But really the big thing there is that in the banking system as we have in South Africa and throughout the world, the reason it works is because people believe it will work. The reality is that if we did all go to our banks and say we want all our money out today, the banks wouldn't have enough liquidity. But because we're not doing that, we believe that the system will be able to repay us as and when we need it. And this is an international version of that. We're saying if there is a crisis, we do have a capital pool that will enable us to deal with the crisis. Now, I mean, James has already said it's probably not big enough if everybody were to fail at once. But as it is, it provides some sense of security. And it's our commitment as part of listen, remember, we want to be able to make waves as an international player. We think it's important that people take us seriously as South Africans. We think it's important that we are key leaders in the AU. We think it's important that we have an international standing. And that comes with a responsibility. But we're not taking money out of the budget. We're not taking money out of the earnings of public sector employees and giving that to the rest of the world.
All right. James, I'm going to get your comment in a minute, but let me go to Yaj in Cape Town. Hello, Yaj.
Morning, Kolani.
Hello.
I agree with what one of your callers is saying the system is obsolete, and your very last guest has very well described this confidence game that they're trying to maintain. It's a con game. It's this based on fractional reserve banking, where banks do not have the liquidity to meet the obligations that the depositors want to pull out. Now, if we put this money in, it is good money thrown after bad. We've got to accept that the global financial system is hopelessly insolvent. This debt-based money system based on compound interest and fractional reserve banking has reached its end of the road. And this is because growth globally is no longer possible because we have reached maximum production of crude oil globally. We've reached a situation of peak oil where our energy resources cannot meet the demand for further growth. So we cannot meet our debt and interest payments, and the whole system, therefore, is prone to collapse.
Okay.
We need monetary reform. We can use this money to establish a public banking system in this country to drive development in renewable energy and a public transport and get people employed gainfully in meaningful employment.
All right, Yaj in Cape Town, thank you. Let me read this email from Siyabonga Sort in Port Elizabeth, who says, we can debate and argue till the wells run dry. The issue here is the failure of capitalism. The donation of the donation to the Bretton Woods Institute to help the situation is not going to work. The austerity measures are like structural adjustment programs that we have experienced in some African countries. Solution is the alternative to the imperialistic globalization. To take people out of work in the name of pushing for growth is like what happens to Greece. How South Africa donate money for people who still vote for austerity measures like in Greece? No logic at all. A great blunder in political expediency, Siyabonga Sotzen. All right, James, you've heard my callers.
I have.
Yeah, what do you think?
I think that I'm not deep enough to talk about the demise of economic systems. I'm afraid. I'm much too simple, and
be simple about it.
I'm afraid all I can do is deal with the world as it presents itself to me.
But are these the discussions that are happening in Greece? Are these the discussions that are happening in your native New York?
Of course, because after the collapse of the Wall Street banks, I think it's inevitable that these are the kind of issues and conversations and debates that will happen. But if you look at you look at decades and centuries of history, you've seen booms, you've seen busts, and you've seen things evolve. And I guess I'm a believer more in evolution than. Things will evolve. Things will, bit by bit, we'll evolve systems that need to deal with what's in front of us.
Dr. Hawkins, your last words for me.
Thank you. I think clearly what the callers are expressing is a lot of frustration at our system, and there is a sense in which there is a real sense of injustice. And I think, when we look at the system, I think the reality is that we don't really have an alternative to capitalism. So what we have to do is say, what was it within the capitalist system that has actually created this? And there's clearly been huge gorging at the trough by banks and others. But can I just make one comment? And I think the comment particularly about Alex and slavery, I think does need a little bit of comment. I mean, this notion that if you are employed, you are in slavery. I think is not actually true.
All right, you know what? Let me just put that aside.
Can I just give one quote? And I mean, this is from Joan Robinson, who was working as an economist at the same time that Bertrand Russell was working. They were all part of these same cliques of people thinking about economics. And the reality is that while we know that when you are employed, there isn't an element to which you are exploited, she said there's only one thing that's worse than being exploited, and that's not being exploited at all.
Okay, I've got to thank you very much. We're completely out of time here. And that means, of course, it's the end of the Forum at 8 this morning. I thank my guests. I think we're going to have to pick up on these discussions, both the call by Alec as well as what Dr. Hawkins was the point she was trying to make here, including the fact that she says we don't have any alternative to capitalism. What do people think? I think a lot of people will have something to say about that. Thank you for listening to the program this day. Thank you to all our producers, and thank you very much for all the emails and SMSs. We shall indeed continue with this discussion. I'm Xolani Gwala, back again tomorrow. It's 9 o'clock. 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 Back again tomorrow. It's 9 o'clock.